All right. So we're rolling.
Okay.
Today is August 23rd,
Correct.
2018. We're in Georgetown, District of Columbia, די.סי, at the home of Judah Rose, correct?
Correct.
And we are going to be talking about two people, your great-grandfather
Okay.
and your grandfather.
Okay.
Let's start with your great-grandfather. If you can tell me his full name.
So his name was Rabbi Judah Rose, so I'm named after him. And he was a rabbi originally born in Galicia.
Poland?
In
Austro-Hungarian?
Yeah, he was actually in the...
Which we call Galicia, right?
Correct. Right, so he's in the westernmost part of Ukraine today.
Lvov.
So he was not far from Lvov, and actually the town is fairly well known in the States, Berzhany, because there's a famous person from Berzhany named Brzezinski.
Okay.
He was a national security advisor to Carter, and his daughter is a TV personality. So it was a mixed, there was Polish Catholics, there was Ukrainian Catholics, Ukrainian Orthodox, and a Jewish community, and he grew up there. He was, as far as we can tell, the third in a line of rabbis, sort of fourth in a line of rabbis, and as far back they go back, we know to the middle of the 1700s. Mm-hmm. And as far as we can know, it goes all the way back. I'm the first generation that's not a rabbi.
Okay.
And it continues after him.
Do you know the name of the Chassidut, or is it just?
I will, if I could just quickly digress. I was in synagogue one day, and someone who I didn't know very well came over to me, and he said, this is about 3 years ago, I have a letter from your great-grandfather. And I didn't know him well, and I'm like, that's not possible. My great-grandfather died in 1943. And he had been called into the house of the person that was responsible for the rescue committee to get Jews out of Europe right up to the period of the Holocaust. Mm-hmm. And he went in there and he found a letter that said Rabbi Judah Rose, the Vada Rabbanim of New York, and he guessed that it was somehow my great-grandfather. So it was 1 in 10,000 chance.
Absolutely.
I totally dismissed it. A few weeks later, he brought it in. My wife, also great woman, did dismiss it also. And it turns out I have a letter from my great-grandfather. And it's just, and the reason I'm mentioning it and what triggered it is he studied under the Belz Rebbe, even though he was a mitnagdim, opponents of the Hasidim, he was very much apparently into Ahavat Israel, and he was a follower of Rabbi Rennes. So he was in the very beginning of the Zionist movement in the Orthodox community. So Rabbi Rennes was the founder of Mizrahi.
Sure.
Rabbi Reins, and this is a picture of Rabbi Judah Rose, my namesake.
Wow. I'm going to take a proper picture of that after, but that's amazing.
Right. This is the synagogue that he established in New York. It's called the Stanton Street Shul. It still exists and operates in New York. So it was founded in 1913, right before the outbreak of World War I.
Stanton and what? Stanton and what, do you know? Because I know that area
It's
very
180
well.
Stanton Street.
Okay, so it's...
And it's a still operating synagogue.
And he was one of the founders of this?
He was the founding rabbi.
Of this synagogue on Rivington Street.
On Stanton Street, in the Lower East Side of Manhattan. And the plaque that commemorates him as the founding rabbi is Rabbi Judah Rose. This is the letter that I received.
Okay.
It's an outstanding Hebrew, and the reason I'm calling attention to it is he was not only a follower.
So the guy that you met at the synagogue had this letter?
He found this letter in a basement in a house in Cincinnati 3 or 4 years ago, a letter from 1938. My Hebrew is excellent, but not good enough to get the handwriting. I had a Hebrew teacher read it to me, and what it said was, please help me as a representative of the...
Who's he addressing it to?
He's addressing it to a Rabbi Gordon, who was the head of the Hatzalah committee in 1938.
In the States?
In the States.
Okay.
And it says, I studied under the Belz Rebbe. He's a Gadol Ador. I want the Hasidim in Galicia know they have friends in the Golden Medina. We've got to work to sort of get them out and let them know. And it's healing a rift between the Mitnagdim and the Hasidim. He was a leader in that. And not only was he with supportive Rabbi Rennes, Rabbi Rennes was famous for setting up not only the Mizrahi, but schools that we were learning work, avodah, and Torah, like high schools and stuff like that. And he actually toured around the country with people who, I am interested if people have ever heard of some of these people. He toured around visiting these schools with people that were known as, I just mentioned 3 names in case anyone knows about it and they could contact me. They were the Pratzker Rebbe, Gedalia Shmilkis, and the Kolomer Magid, I believe Yitzchak Weber. So he was touring around with Rabbi Rennes, and that was one of the big project that they had in the pre-World War I period to instill not only...
Pre-World War II.
Pre-World War I.
Oh, pre-World War I. Okay.
So the Rabbi Judah Rose, involved in pre-World War I in Galicia, moves to the United States right before the outbreak of the war, becomes a leader in the Jewish community of Orthodoxy in Manhattan in New York, is in the Vada Rabbanim, and he's writing letters back to Galicia and back to people here in the States to try to coordinate the rescue. And so that's the milieu that my grandfather grew up in. And the milieu that he grew up in was a series of Orthodox rabbis that were known as experts in various different aspects of the Shulchan Aruch, were teachers of the lead rabbis in Lemberg or Lvov, the capital of Galicia, authors of things like the Shaul Meshiv and various and commentaries on various different commentaries on the Shulchan Aruch. So they were known as in the Orthodox mainstream. He broke with the Orthodox mainstream, Rabbi Judah Rose, to become a leading Zionist and work with Rabbi Raines, who died during World War I in 1915. Anyway, my grandfather is growing up in this milieu.
Well, before we get to your grandfather, your great-grandfather roughly arrives here 1900 or something like that, roughly?
So he arrives around 1912, 13 in the synagogue.
He's 13.
Is 13. The war breaks out in 14, and the first battlefront is Galicia.
Yeah.
So he's very lucky.
Between the Russians and the Germans.
And the Austro-Hungarians.
Austro-Hungarians.
And then the Germans very quickly.
I think there's the Battle of Tannenberg, which is not far from that area, but so he actually leaves right before the break of war. Right before the break of war.
And my grandfather, even though he's born in 1898.
Yeah. Is that your grandfather was born in 1898?
Right.
So actually, your grandfather made the voyage with the family. Just a second. So your grandfather immigrated with his family. Actually.
Right.
I had the impression, I don't know whether he came alone, but of course that makes sense that he came with his family. So they leave right before the outbreak of the First World War. They arrive and they settle in the Lower East Side?
Lower East Side.
Yeah.
And because he was a leader in Birzhani, it was easy for him to establish a synagogue. And he moved up very quickly to be a leader in the Vad. Anyway, so that was the milieu that my grandfather grew up in. He gets 2 degrees from St. John's University.
So now we're talking about your grandfather and his name?
Rabbi Morris Rose.
Morris Rose. Morris is Moshe?
Yes, Moshe Mordechai. Rav Moshe Mordechai.
Rose. And how is it spelled in Hebrew? Rose, it's
the Resh, Aleph, Zion, sometimes Aleph. There is an issue as to whether at some point where they were saying Rosa. But for sure in the period of time of my grandfather, it was Rose. I think in the term of my great-grandfather, it was Rosa. It was a minor variation. It wasn't like it was Rosenberg or something like that. It was a minor variation.
So let's get now a little bit more in depth about your grandfather, Morris.
Right.
So he's an immigrant, and apparently he has a very clear way of what his role in the community is from his father. I'm sure you have a lot on your shoulders as he probably did, that he has to go in a certain direction. But it seems to be that your great grandfather has more I don't want to say liberal, but I'm sure like you were saying, St. John's, that education is important not only in the cheder but also in So you can...
Right, so the idea of avodah and Torah, which manifests itself in sort of modern orthodoxy in the States,
Sure.
or, yeah, exactly. He definitely was a follower of that, because he actually got 2 law degrees from St. John's University, in addition to eventually getting a rabbinic degree from what was called the Jewish Institute of Religion.
And that was where?
That was in New York. It was an independent rabbinical entity that was founded by people that were uncomfortable with the Reform movement. It was founded in the same year as the Mandate in Palestine was established in 22, and they didn't feel that the main Reform movement was sufficiently Hebraic and sufficiently Zionist, because it was coming out of Cincinnati, and while it was moving more and more Zionist, they were dissatisfied. So they created a new rabbinical school, and he was in the first graduating class.
Again, what was the name of the school?
Jewish Institute of Religion.
Jewish Institute of Religion. So just for me to understand, the platform of this institute is modern Orthodox, what we'd call it today, or would it?
First of all, just right away, it eventually fell apart and became absorbed into the HUC, the Hebrew Union College, the mainstream of the Reform movement. But in its heyday, it was established as an explicitly non-denominational effort to get highly educated rabbis that could reach out in a pro-Zionist, Hebraic-oriented way to the professional classes and the educated classes that were emerging that could only relate to rabbis that had a very, very broad education. So that was the goal. And the joke in the family was that he was the president of the first graduating class. There were 3 people in the class, including himself. And it was known as a hotbed of fervent Zionism, and it was also many of the people that were involved. It was also a hub for smuggling arms later on to Israel. So the JIR, Stephen Weiss, so that's the milieu that he graduates, he's a rabbi, and he is immediately drawn to Jabotinsky.
At this point, because Jabotinsky at this point is, we're talking about 1922, 23, he's known, but he's not, there's still not the riff in the Zionist movement that comes in 33, where he really takes stage as the so-called opposition.
Right.
But before we get to that, I just want to get a little bit more info and background about your grandfather, and on a personal. So does he see himself as an American? Does he see himself? Does he like his new homeland? I mean, he came. He was like 14 or something like that.
Yeah. Let me just sort of say is that coming from, if you will, almost a hyper-Zionist orientation, I can also say the following: that none of my relatives, going up in either direction, in my opinion, ever had a day in their lives where they weren't thankful for being in the United States. And so they were hyper, patriotic, and my grandfather was in that category as well. Now he turned out, as we'll describe, was an opponent of of Roosevelt. He was an opponent of the mainstream of the community. The community is, okay, there's Zion, this is in the 20s, anti-Zionists and Zionists, and in the Zionists, there is a minority that's for Jabotinsky, and a majority that's for the other movements, Ben Gurion and Weizmann, et cetera.
The mainstream.
And so that he was drawn to Jabotinsky.
Do you know what it was that, because we're talking about, like I said, 1922, 23, 24, Jabotinsky actually, I think, is just released from prison, and he's released by the British, and they're like, we're going to release you, but you're never going to come back here. You're out. So I think he went to Europe or to the States. He had to regroup himself. So it's these are the years where he's really kind of at the beginning of his of being a big figure in the Zionist movement.
So this is a very there's 2 major complicated historical issues that I deal with my family. One is, first of all, how did his generation, he was fairly traditional, but he wasn't Orthodox. My father, also rabbi, wasn't Orthodox. How did that break occur? Was it smooth? That's one issue. Another issue is how did how did they get a position that was such a minority position? Now, my view of it is that coming from the Mizrahi or the Zionist religious orientation, the one that's very dominant in Israel today, if you will, on both sides, there's a natural affinity between the Jabotinsky movement or the Jabotinsky branch and religious Zionism. Because the thing that makes Jabotinsky so stand out is Jews have to fight, have an absolute right to the territory, and that absolute right can only be somehow related to a divine right, if you will. And so I think it's so there's some degree of naturalness that if you make the bridge from Orthodoxy to Zionism, you're going to end up in this orientation. But still, it was a minority view, and the reason why I'm here right now is because there was another rabbi who was the grandfather of a friend of mine. I had no idea, who had the same affinity. He ended up a fairly known Reform rabbi who took a minority position that was out of step with, doubly out of step. Hyper-Zionist against many people who were not Zionists. The people who had money at the time, many of them were anti-Zionists, and then within the Zionist community to take that view. I think that he never had any doubt, my grandfather, that we had an absolute right to the land. Mm-hmm. He was extremely sensitive, just like Jabotinsky was, to the impending Holocaust. He spoke Yiddish, and he saw it coming, and the idea that Jews had to fight was absolutely clear to him. And now, why did other people not come to that conclusion? You know, it's an almost unknowable issue, but of course it's emerged as a dominant ideological view in Israel.
This is a very general question, and I don't know if you have an answer. But whenever I'm talking to someone or about someone, you always ask, where was the hook, where was the moment, or what was the thing that happened that made your grandfather say to himself, this guy's right. This is what.
It's lost. The only thing I can say is that it's almost immediate. So this is a picture from the second conference of the Zionist revisionist movement. This is the original. It's from Paris, 1926. So it's I would say it's a number one sort of heirloom that I've received. My grandfather is the U.S. representative. He was the president of the Zionist revisionist.
Is he in this picture?
Yes. So my grandfather is right here.
Hold on. Where's your grandfather?
Right here. Right there, that's him.
Okay, let's just move this a little closer. This is your grandfather?
Right, yeah, and that's Jabotinsky.
Right. So this was the second annual
So they're founded, as best as I can tell, they're founded, and this is the first really formal meeting. The previous one was less formal, and there was a presidium. He's sitting at the front table as the representative of the United States. So as soon as Jabotinsky formally established the movement, he became the American representative. He's very young,
he's dressed very modern too. He's not like, there's no beard. He took that. If you look at your great dad, his father, he's got the look. Your father definitely has
a much more modern look.
Much more modern, and of course, most of these people in this picture are basically. So this is interesting. This is 1926 in Paris. So your father here is already fully engaged, and he's just committed. I mean, this is 1926. This is before the 1929 Arab Revolt. Like when. I mean, Jabotinsky here is, I think, literally maybe 2 or 3 years out of prison. I mean, he was in prison, Aqua prison, from 1920 to 24 or 23, and then he was pardoned by Herbert Samuel.
Right.
And this is a fascinating picture. What do you know about this meeting, this specific one? Is there anything that you know about it, that you've read about it, that you would like to share?
By the way, I'm an economist. I specialize in energy, so I'm not a historian or anything.
That's fine.
But the geographic locus or focus of the movement was Poland, out of which Begin emerges, and that's sort of the real energy there. It turns out that there was support in the United States, and he ends up in the United States, Jabotinsky. But it was never to the fervent degree that it was in Poland. So my grandfather was the representative, and so they're struggling at this period of time with a very strong activist base that is getting a lot of support from the Polish government. The actual Polish government itself is philo-Semitic and philo-Zionist for a number of reasons, and actually arming the Beitar.
Really?
Yes.
Okay.
And this comes out in
Researches or stuff like papers, yeah.
There's a new book that's out on this, which I have in my library, which I can show you. But anyway, shockingly, right? Because later, in some sense, Poland is known for both a lot of anti-Semitism as well. But in this period of time, I can't remember the name, Sadulski or there's
one of those generals.
One of those generals.
And they were not. They didn't really like. It was not. But also, at the same time, Poland is, the foundation of Hashomer Tzair and all of these kind of so-called opposition movements. I mean, they were not. They were very different ideological.
Now there was also a urgency. The Jabotinsky movement was urgent. We got to settle right away. Got to get everyone out now. Of course, he makes the famous speech. There's a volcano in the name of God. Get out. We know you're busy. My grandfather. There's some stories in the family that because he was so multilingual, would report back to Jews in the United States. Like he would actually go to Nazi events in Europe and actually listen to what they were saying.
Your grandfather.
My grandfather, and so he could articulate the growing threat.
To see it, to hear it.
To hear it.
Yeah.
And so he was, convinced. He was in Israel in 1933. He's in Europe. It's a little bit parallel to what Jabotinsky's doing, but at a much lower level. To the point where most of the biographies of Jabotinsky do not mention my grandfather. However, it turns out the reason that you're here and I'm here is there's a recent book in the States called Racing Against the Time.
Okay.
And in it, it's describing Jabotinsky's...
Just look at me, yeah.
It's describing Jabotinsky's effort to create a Jewish army to fight Hitler, to parallel what he did in World War I.
Right, with the Jewish Brigade.
Right, exactly. And
which he was in.
Which he was in.
Yeah.
Yep, he was in. He was a lieutenant. He was one of 3 people in the history of the British Army to be an officer but not to be a citizen.
Right.
And so in this book, they describe the speech that he gives around the time of Dunkirk, describing, in New York, this is Jabotinsky.
Dunkirk is 1939?
1940, June 1940.
Well, that's right before he died, because he died in 40.
Right. And I guess the reason I'm highlighting this is not only because it's fascinating what Jabotinsky's doing at the last minute. It's like, we are going to have to fight this out. He establishes defense doctrine with the Walls speech that he has. Anyway, he's still doing it at the end. But anyway, the way they cut off this article, they actually have Mr. Rabbi M. Rose. So if he had just cut it off just like half an inch higher.
And were you ever able to retrieve where this came from? Or?
Yeah, this is looking from the New York Times or one of I knew about it. But in this book, the way he cuts the article includes Rabbi Morris Rose, which was a big deal. And most of the other biographies don't mention my grandfather at all. But this biography, the book is a quasi-biography of Jabotinsky. And anyway, so I put this on Facebook, and a guy I've known since 1989 noticed, the next name, that's my grandfather. Another Reform rabbi who stuck out his neck to support Jabotinsky. This is Saul Newman, and we know him. He worked with my wife to get on the search committee for our new rabbi here in the synagogue. He's the president came. I've known him since 1989 and never came. I didn't even know.
What's the other name?
It was Rabbi Louis Newman.
And what does it say there about them?
They also spoke. So Jabotinsky is the main speaker, and they're also speaking. And so he was because he was so erudite and so educated, right? I mean, how many people have 2 degrees in law from St. John's University and also have the traditional Jewish background and also have a rabbinic degree, so rabbi, doctor, so he would be the face of the revisionist movement in the States. So the number of articles he writes where people say, oh, the Jabotinsky movement is a fascist movement. And what he writes back is the following: I was there when they founded the movement and no one talked about fascism. He's got other articles he publishes where he says, people say, oh, by the way, you cannot endorse communism as a basis for life in Israel when you don't live a communist life here. So he was foursquare in the Jabotinsky movement, both on the economic and ideological orientation. He was also in refuting the idea of fascism, that the community, the group was fascist.
So he was shaking that off if there was like, you know, I can tell you an interesting story about fascism and not a story, but just a little anecdote. One of my closest friends in Israel is the grandson of Avram Stern.
Okay, sure.
Who at the beginning was a complete follower of Jabotinsky.
Sure.
And in 1936, he went to Florence on a scholarship. He studied philosophy at the Hebrew University. And he, and I'm talking about him at the time, he was just a minor guy. He hadn't, you know, but he writes how fascinated he was by the uniforms of the fascists. It had such a big, impression on him, you know, like the uniforms and all of these things. But at this time of this conference here, I mean, I know we're talking, this is about Dunkirk, but here in 1926 in Paris, you know, this is really, like I said, I mean, there hasn't even been the split yet in the Zionist movement, officially.
It's just very, it's occurring, so from day one he's there. He's an American representative, and just like Jabotinsky cuts a great figure, if you will, like in a public relations view, in terms of his view is very much democratic, etc. But there were people who, you know, they were planning to fight. Okay, they wanted to fight. There was Ben Shlomo. There's issues about how far they went, and there's a whole dispute about it. And of course, Jabotinsky spent time in Italy in the period of time in which Mussolini's taking power. Mussolini doesn't become anti-Semitic, you know, until 38. So, you know, the idea was, you know, how do you present yourself? And so my grandfather was good at presenting himself in that regard. The other thing that caused me to realize that, you know, I had this relationship with Newman is that my grandfather buried Jabotinsky. So for many of the Jabotinsky acolytes worldwide, his death was a huge blow. He died in New York. He was buried in New York.
In the Beitar camp in upstate, yeah.
And he was not, you know, for sure wasn't Orthodox. He was buried by my grandfather, and so he was my grandfather.
Was at his.
He was the officiating rabbi. And
what is that document right there?
This is the notice of basically the funeral rites.
Can you read it to me?
It says, Jabotinsky writes today, veterans organizations to take part in service for Zionists. Funeral services for Vladimir Jabotinsky, leader of the new Zionist organization who died Saturday, will be held at noon today, Gramercy Park, Memorial Chapel, etc. 3 rabbis, Morris M. Rose, N. Tolushkin, and H.F. Epstein will officiate, and a group of cantors will assist in the services. There's another article that says that my grandfather was the one that officiated, and so for those who revere Jabotinsky, that was part of the trauma. The other was the great moment in '63 when he was brought back to Israel and buried in Herzl. Rabbi Eshkol did it.
Yep. Well, he did it. You know, Begin was working on it for a long time, and then when Eshkol came in, they brought his back to Israel. Now,
my grandfather was also always on the edge in terms of his.
Did he? I'm just sorry. In his professional life, did he practice law?
No, so he was a rabbi. So he never, I think, as far as I can tell, never practiced law a day, even though he had 2 law degrees. It's very unusual to even have a PhD in law who does that. So, and what it was is that for most of this period of time, he's in a synagogue, right, where they have a mechitza upstairs and a joint seating downstairs of the reverse. And so he's sort of in the community itself is in this process of de-orthodoxization. And he is, you know, I can't tell how strong the split was. There is evidence anecdotally that the split was strong because We never went to the Stanton Street shul.
You never went? No.
Not until as an adult.
So where did he move to?
So he was like in Brooklyn, you know, and in Queens and various different locations like that. And I even had dinner with him up 2 blocks from the synagogue. He never mentioned the synagogue. There was never any real discussion of what it was to go from Orthodox leadership to a process of de-Orthodoxization.
Something happened. Something happened, yeah. And you can see it also a little bit of it if you look at this picture of him. I mean, he looks like he has gone through a transformation. And is he open and public about his connections to Beitar and to his?
He is. So one of the tensions which I don't fully understand is that in his synagogue, he's known as was Rabbi Newman, he was the president of the revisionist movement in the United States. So there's no
can't hide that.
Can't hide that. And he's speaking at Madison Square Garden or whatever, with Jabotinsky, et cetera. I think that was accepted. I think where things got a little hairy for him, and where he was clearly warned, was he was an outspoken opponent, as I mentioned, of Roosevelt. This is like a march of rabbis.
Can you hold it up?
It is a march of rabbis that he led. He's right here in the forefront of this, demanding that the Jews be allowed to go to Palestine. And
it's hard to read the writing, but I'm trying to figure out what year this is.
This is like 46, 45.
Okay.
Here's November 1945. All these rabbis are off to protest, the policy of not.
That's your grandfather.
That's right there.
Right?
Yeah.
Yep. And that's him right here.
Right.
Right?
And so he was very strident in where he had the biggest problems was he was opposed to Roosevelt's policy and some of the Truman's president already of not having Israel opened up to the refugees, etc. I don't think that it was one of these things where during the war he was saying, "Oh, it's bomb Auschwitz." I don't think people knew it like that.
Right. But he was very he was vocal after the war about, okay, this is what happened now. Please,
let's open this up right away.
Yeah, let's open this up right. And you're saying that he was warned to kind of keep a low profile or not.
The president of the synagogue said, "You're going to lose your job if you ever criticize Roosevelt again." Now, these are like anecdotes that are coming down.
Sure.
In a way that doesn't really fully illuminate again how is it that Reform Rabbi, he wasn't alone, but could be a person who ended up being mostly a Reform Rabbi. How could you be a supporter of Jabotinsky, who was a minority, and also how do you what happened how did his father react to his non-Orthodox status? So these are, for me, these are great mysteries and of great interest.
So, roughly around this time, Jabotinsky he's passed away. In Israel, or at the time Palestine, Begin's not in charge of Beitar, but he's in charge of the Etzel.
Right.
And he's underground. I mean, you can't pick up the phone and talk to him. There must be some kind of rift between what's going on in Palestine and what's going on with these guys here in New York City or in LA or in Boston, who are Beitar people, who are older than Begin. Like your grandfather. They're older. They're like 15, 16 years older than him. What are they doing? They must be very, very much against the mandate, very much against that they're not letting Jews in who have survived the Holocaust. And as far as geopolitical issue thing, the War of Independence it's boiling. It hasn't started officially until the partition at the UN, but. Besides doing these protests and criticizing publicly Roosevelt or Truman, Roosevelt's also dead, what is he doing?
Those are the main things. So what I intuited, first of all, I don't think he was as high profile as Rabbi Newman. Mm-hmm. Obviously he's a leader, but all around him people are smuggling weapons. but there's like this element of plausible deniability since he's the person that would be like representing the movement, the revisionist movement.
You have to have your hands clean.
You have to have your hands clean. So he wasn't, nor did I get the sense that he was as connected to wealthy people as some of the other people.
Sure.
So he was in the front guy. Here's the PhD rabbi.
Here's the face.
Here's the face.
The clean face.
Right.
like I'm quotation marks clean. I mean, it's not that.
Right. And I also feel like at some point, once the state is established, it no longer is. The revisionist movement it's pretty much all transferred to Israel, and Begin's clearly the leader. And so he did get a medal from Begin. Personally gave him this Jabotinsky medal in recognition of the service that he had for the
Is there
revision.
anything written on the back, or is it just?
There's a picture of Jabotinsky. And it's a great quote, and it sends shiver up the spine. Tzion kula shalanu. So it was given after the 6-Day War. And so, I mean, I know that he was very proud of it. I did want to also say that my mother recently was going through the garage. It's like she didn't find the Dead Sea Scrolls, but she did. She lives in Florida, and she's got like a garage there. And she pulls up like this business card.
Chag Sameach.
Written by Vladimir Jabotinsky. It's his business card.
Okay, we're going to take a picture of this after, but this is business card.
So I said, Mom,
and it says on the bottom, London.
Yeah, right. Is that right? At the period of time.
President of the new Zionist organization.
So this is the movement that he founded, the formal movement.
Vladimir.
Yeah, and it's like, okay, well, keep digging, Mom. What do you got there?
So your mom is this is her father.
So no, it's my father's father. It's all patrilineal.
That's what I thought.
But she remembers Rabbi Newman very well, but it never came up.
Of course, and these people weren't about that also.
It never came up.
And so do you know about what kind of things? I mean, not that he was involved with because he had to keep a clean front, but about smuggling. I know that there's this guy Hecht who was a very famous scriptwriter, playwright, who was involved with Beitar and Etzel.
There's on my mother's side there was some record of Golda Meir coming to the house and raising money. This is in Cincinnati. My mother was from Cincinnati, and it was for arms.
Sure.
There's really no evidence in the family lore that my grandfather was involved at all in those efforts. Again, it was like it was plausible deniability is the way I took it. He was also like a minor functionary for the U.S. government. He was involved in running the draft board during World War II and deferments like that, things like that.
He was a good citizen.
He was like a leader during the Prohibition to get an exemption for use of wine for religious purposes, yep. Sacramental purposes. So he was the perfect person not to know about illegal activities.
Sure.
So this is intuited, but anyway, so I don't have any of those great stories.
Okay.
They're great.
That's absolutely fine. That's absolutely good. And like I said to you, the purpose of this archive is so that somebody like your grandfather, his name will be in it, so that when we're all way gone from this Gilgul, it's there.
And there's tremendous pride in the role that he played, my grandfather. So don't get me wrong in any way. I mean, just to give you a sense of like how out of control it is, we recently had this picture redone. It's an original of Jabotinsky, a lithograph. I don't know what they call it, but an etching or something like that. Mm-hmm. So it's not like there's any degree to which we're not proud. It's just I don't want to exaggerate. I know a lot of people did a lot more. He wasn't like on the Ottoline or anything.
Right. No. That's
right.
It's actually interesting because I interviewed in Florida a few months ago a Cuban Jew who was on the Ottoline. Yeah, and he was 17 years old, right. 18. But that's what's good here is that we have also these these photographs, which I'm gonna take very soon in the metal and everything. But I mean, as far as your grandfather, as you were his grandson, is there anything that you can tell me about him on a personal note? Did you? I mean, you knew him.
Yeah. So he was. An extrovert, a little bit like me. He liked to have a good time. When we would go to his house on Sunday, he would make me a highball, which was ginger ale and bourbon or something like that. It would be like 14. Mm-hmm. He could tell jokes with people of any age. He had a good sense of humor. Yeah. He had a brother who was a rabbi also. He was one of 11. Mm-hmm. Rabbi Judah Rose had 11 kids. And 2 of them became rabbis, and they may have gone once or twice to like professional wrestling, but he had was willing to do that.
What's up with the wrestling? Because my great grandmother, who lived in New York, she would go every Saturday or Sunday to these wrestling matches, and she loved it. I have no idea.
So it was like a weird amalgam because he also liked opera and classical music, and he spoke a number of different languages.
Which he probably spoke Yiddish.
Yiddish.
Russian.
German. He could go and he could hear the Nazis speak in their own language, and when he would go to Europe, he just like Jabotinsky, there was a sense that he was giving speeches similar to Jabotinsky, the volcano speech, and so again, it's rare. I mean, as as a non-historian, as I look back, I think about the prescience of Jabotinsky. It's really hard to match that.
Would he talk to you about Jabotinsky? Would he tell you, or it was just very like that's who I am and that's it, and
it was more, when you're young, I gravitated immediately towards his orientation. So he was the lodestone for me ideologically and intellectually. I think where I differed with him is I've become Orthodox, and so I've been very involved in Orthodoxy here in די.סי, etc. So there I disagree, but I think it's more a function of the generation that I'm in. Sure. Relative to that. So that was a very, very high respect situation, and he was highly respected for this. And I was precocious enough to appreciate this, but not to the degree that I can now that I'm 60. And it was, while we would ask him things, he died in 83, he died at 85. And so it was hard to sort of tease out exactly what was going on there. So for example, then going back in like the classic biographies, right, there's the Shmuel Katz biography of Jabotinsky. It's one of the 2 volumes, so it's like a major work. He's not in there. And so it was hard to tease out how much of it was family lore, and so I was surprised. I ran across this just within the last 3 or 4 months. It was just trying to tease out what does it mean to be the president of the Zionist organization. He knew Netanyahu's father.
Benzion?
Yeah, but he was already, at that time when Jabotinsky died, my grandfather was 42, and I think Benzion was, I don't know, younger. Yeah. There was a generational difference there, but he knew him. So he was a fun guy. He was an opinionated guy. There may be a gene for that we haven't revealed yet, but I may have gotten some of that. And for me, it's sort of a very a weird thing because I am the 7th in the line, right? As far as we know, there's a continual line of rabbis, and so I often think about him and my father and my great grandfather. Sure. And also I think a lot about that connection. That's a big deal.
Did anybody in the family ever mention? I think it was the Zionist Congress. I think in '33, and I think it was in Prague when the Zionist movement clearly split between Arlozorov, Ben Gurion, Sharet, and Jabotinsky. I think it was 33. And there was a big rift there, which of course, because when we go back to the history books, he was in the Haganah at the beginning, but that wasn't the Haganah of the 40s.
Right. So, so my father went to Camp Beitar. It's unclear to the extent to which when my grandfather was speaking, whether he was being physically protected by the Beitar. And the rift clearly is in 25, 26. That's when it's established. But the rift takes on a very intense hue when there's also the issue of what to do with the Nazis. And there was a view that the best thing to do was to collaborate with the Nazis in 33, 34, 35, get the Jews out, get whatever property you can out, and then there was that murder. I think the Lazarov murder, like you alluded to.
Sure, that was actually in 1933. And yes, that was a huge rift, and I think research very recently came to the conclusion there was some kind of, that actually it was, this is just one of the speculations, that it wasn't
right.
the Biryonim or whatever, it was actually
some
two
Arabs right.
that it was a hit on the orders of Joseph Goebbels, because Arlozorov had an affair with his wife before she became a fanatic Nazi.
Right.
And they went to the same university, something like that. But I could tell you that I also interviewed somebody who was in Alechi who told me that when he was in Akko prison, he was with two Arabs there who told him that they knocked him off on the beach. But anyways, so that just threw more fuel into the...
But he was absolutely strident. I mean, when he sort of says, I understand you're saying that this movement is a fascist movement. I was there and you weren't. There's no fascism there.
Right.
Don't come and tell me that the future of Israel is going to be communist.
Yeah.
And don't advocate it for the community if you're not advocating it for yourself.
Correct.
Because no one here in the States is doing that.
Correct.
You got to stop doing that. So he was absolutely adamant. In those internecine ideological disputes, he was adamantine. Now, as to whether he had to be physically protected, et cetera, and that's unclear. I think, again, he floated, I think, above that to a certain degree, or on the side, or whatever, because he was had that was his job. That's the way I took it from it.
And like you said, he passed away in 1983?
Right. Did. Yep. And, I don't think he had any doubt that what he did was a big deal.
And of course, he did go to Israel.
He did. He was there in 33 several times, and there wasn't a day in his life that he either doubted the greatness of the United States or that the divine right of the Jews to Israel. So, I think he came by it. That he certainly came by it honestly with his from his father and all the rabbis before him.
I think we're good.
Okay, very good.
Is there anything that we didn't talk about that you feel that we've didn't touch, or?
No, the only thing I would sort of say is that there is some people in the previous generations who were involved in teaching, people who wrote books like Shaul Umeshiv. And if anyone knows anything about Rabbi Nathanson of Lemberg, who wrote that book, or any of the rabbinics related to Yorei Da'ah, and which my great-grandfather was an expert in, or something like that, I'd like to hear from them. But this is how it all happened. The good news about Facebook is when I had no idea that this would trigger this whole thing with Saul Newman, who's a great guy.
And this picture right here, this is
my grandfather on the right, holding up the award that my father got, Rabbi Herbert Rose, my father, alav shalom, for service, to the Jewish community. My father was in Hebrew Union College, graduate in 1955.
This is your father?
My father.
So it's father and son?
Father and son.
Okay.
And my father was, I will say, I wanted to say, he was a leader in the Free Soviet Jewry movement. This is before 67, this is 1966. He was the leader of a rally for Soviet Jewry that's mentioning he was the rally coordinator. And so he was following in his father's footsteps in that regard. I don't have a picture right here, but during the Six-Day War, Robert Kennedy spoke at a rally that he coordinated at Roosevelt Raceway. I personally remember being, at the time, 9, going to a pro-Israel demonstration in Washington, D.C. during the Six-Day War. It happened to be that when we were there, they announced they had captured the Suez Canal. And so my father followed to extent in my grandfather's footsteps, but it was in a different milieu, and it certainly wasn't, as part of the Jabotinsky movement. He was always sympathetic to that, but it wasn't in that context. And I will also say one other thing, which I think is a little personal note that's worth mentioning. This is my father's grave, and he has as his epitaph, Laman Tzion Lo Echasheh. For the sake of Zion, I will not be silent. One of the reasons I emphasize that is it's also written on my grandfather's tombstone.
Same thing.
Same thing. And, having found evidence of Isaiah in the last couple of months, the Bula of Isaiah next to the Bula of Hezekiah,
Those are two hardcore prophets.
Right.
They didn't mess around.
And Laman Tzion Echasheh is what Isaiah said. It's sort of like it gives you a sense of where we're all coming from.
Okay, so what we're going to do now is I'm going to take some photographs.
Okay.
Okay.